would you be able to tell me, a Philistine, what national conservatism is? What does it mean?
Well, that was a really lovely introduction. I didn't really deserve that, but then again, I've got curly hair and I don't really feel like I deserve that either. So national conservatism is an American movement, and it is what's called a post-liberal movement. So it's a reaction basically against what it sees as increasing trends of globalization, towards globalization, that have eroded the nation state, and also a 50 years of kind of socially progressive politics that have focused on the liberalisation of the individual as the sole end of politics. And it's a kind of counterweight to that sees, I suppose, a bit returny really. It wants to return to the making the nation state the primary kind of building block. It wants to reinstitute, place quite a heavy importance on family, because it's an American movement, places quite a lot of stock on God. And in terms of economics, it talks a lot about more protectionist policies, way more interventionist than conservatives would normally be comfortable with. So it's kind of trying to rebuild the idea of a nation state around a cohesive polity, basically.
What do you see as the key points of difference between, let's say, a sort of current, modern, contemporary, whatever you want to call it, sort of post-liberal socialist response? Because I think a lot of people with sort of a more progressive left-wing politics, let's say, they'd probably agree with a lot of these national conservatives on the diagnosis of the problems in Britain, whether it's, you know, the state of public services, infrastructure, local economies, communities. What's the point of difference with the solutions to those problems?
I think a lot of the times that the solutions are actually broadly quite similar. So I think, you know, for instance, you know, we talk about the rebuilding the foundation blocks of the economy. Basically, everybody under the age of 45 agrees what the problems are, and it's not building enough infrastructure and it's not building enough housing.
Yep.
And actually, a lot of the policy solutions are very, very similar. But in terms of the differences between kind of traditional socialism, it still doesn't believe in a redistributive state.
Yep.
It still believes in a it places more emphasis, I suppose, on the state playing a more preventative than palliative role. So it wants a much stronger state that is able to step in before economic problems become social catastrophes, rather than doing it afterwards, which it sees as fundamentally pointless and just leading to big government, which then erodes society, and it erodes you know, things like the family, because then you become more dependent on the welfare state.
What do you see as some of the key tensions within the movement, within its ideology? It's very early days yet, particularly here in the UK. So I've seen some of the criticism and discussion around national conservatism as an ideology, that it's a little bit incoherent. But what do you, in your view, what are sort of the key tensions within it? Where are the points of difference, and how might it struggle, perhaps particularly in its British context?
Well, the big kind of tension is that it is an American movement and it is geared towards America. So it places a big importance on God. Like, it is quite religious, and it's not clear that will fly here. In fact, no, it is pretty clear it won't fly here, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Like, we are a completely secular nation. The other thing is, it's not quite clear how that will sit with a society that has like much higher participation rates in religion amongst non-Christian communities. So religion is really one of the big things they've got to hash out, but the other big thing is the economy. So national conservatism talks a lot about the structure of the economy. It talks a lot about you know, kind of more protectionist policies, more intervention, because the Americans can afford to talk about the structure of the economy, because they are pretty much by every measure the richest nation in the world, and we are very much not that. You know, GDP per capita, we're now poorer than Mississippi, which is the poorest US state. Our problems are not, well, we do have structural kind of problems in the economy, but the problems of our economy are foundational, and it's things like we haven't got enough housing. We have an absolutely fucking shit infrastructure system. We have really crappy transport. We have a coming energy crunch that is going to be absolutely devastating to people. And unless we keep buying energy from abroad, it's going to push bills up. It's going to make last year look like a walk in the park. So taking on the kind of structure of the economy and the foundation is I think the big thing that it needs to focus on.
You've been in the room during the speeches. What's the vibe on the conference floor? And then we'll get into a little bit about what the speakers are saying and who's left an impression.
So I think the vibe is broadly that kind of people are welcoming it for trying to turn post-liberalism from kind of head in the clouds to feet in the mud.
Yeah.
And they're hoping it will be the start of something. But I think there have been a few tensions in the kind of speakers that have been there, and the incoherence and the kind of baffling array of the ideologies of the speakers that have left people kind of a bit confused. So I think if this were going to be National Conservatism and this is how it is, I don't think it will fly, because it's not even getting that strong a buy-in from the people that are there. But I think once it spins out and it starts to consider how it might work in Britain properly, then I think it has room.
There's been a few big beasts of the Conservative Party, capital C Conservative Party, addressing the conference, whose ideas, well, for me anyway, I think there's a question about whether or not some of the stuff that Suella Braverman was talking about, for example, I don't think she said something about where you begin doesn't really matter. And if you're talking about conservatism, then where you begin actually is quite relevant, because you're talking about a movement that's based, finds its roots in identity and tradition and the long sort of sprawl of institutions. And, there's also quite a lot of sort of free market advocates going around, that sort of, I think you were saying at the top of this, that sort of individualistic, perhaps a little bit libertarian bent to it. Is there anyone really actually in the sort of Conservative Party itself who's advocating for these ideas, or sits closely within it, or do you think it's more they, as part of the Conservative tradition, they are addressing the flaw, but they're not really proponents or adherents to the ideology that's being espoused here? What's your read on that?
I think there are people who speak to certain elements of it. Okay. So I think like Michael Gove is developing, starting to acknowledge that actually we do need a slightly more protectionist economy. I don't think you could call Michael Gove a proper true blue free marketeer anymore.
Yeah.
Braverman also is on board with their immigration policy, which is very, very restrictive, even though she is overseeing the highest immigration rate that this country has ever seen.
It's the small matter of being responsible for the immigration policy.
Yeah. My sister in Christ, you are responsible for the immigration policy. So it's developing as a new movement. It's yet to pull, I think, a great deal of people in. I think Miriam Cates and Denny Kruger are probably the two MPs that are on it the most. They do some work with their think tank, whatever it's called, the new Social Covenant Unit, that is talking very much about kind of family policy and making family policy actually about family formation and not getting women back into work, which is a great idea. And you could be totally on board with that, but that also does need costing, because 78% of nurses, I think, are women. So where are you going to find those? I mean, obviously not all of them are going to go off and become mothers, but if you're not getting them back into the workforce quickly, that's how the economy is structured. So you need to come up with a policy costing for how you're going to make that work.
Yeah, I think Kruger said some interesting stuff. He, I believe the words "Marx was right" came out of his mouth on the floor to the he was talking about the bourgeois middle class. So I think it's interesting, isn't it? That indicates to me a sort of degree of intellectual freedom and a willingness to sort of diagnose the problems in society, because I think he was quite punchy about sort of the Conservatives' record in government, basically. He was talking about austerity, talking about the things we were mentioning earlier. It's quite brave for a Conservative MP to take the stage and say those things to that audience, because it's not like it's a private conversation in the Red Line, right? It's punchy, and it almost, I think it gives lie to the fact that actually there's quite a lot at stake here. That really, I think the reason why these conferences of interest to me and to the Pubcast, we're going to talk about it at length in the rest of the episode with Ed and Ava. This is kind of the battle for the ideological soul of the Conservative Party, and depending on how our next general election goes, we could find ourselves with the party shifting towards this kind of NatCon type of ideology. If a week is a long time in politics, obviously, and it's a long way away. Anything could happen. But it's interesting that people are being that frank about it and forthright. I think it's interesting, to say the least. I mean, it's a bit of a naff word, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think this speaks to what I like to call the based sound dichotomy in the Conservative Party. So the battle for the soul of the party will basically be between, the vast majority will be between, it's not really going to be a battle though, is it?
No.
Because we're going to have so few MPs, it's basically going to be a scuffle.
Yeah. A minor altercation. A steward shepherding someone out of a gig for heckling.
Yeah. There is going to be a kind of sound caucus, which will be, probably reliant on the new Liz Truss think tank. It will be people like the ASI and the IEA who will be, banging the drum for free market and free trade. And then there will be a whole kind of swath of very much newer, think tanks like Onward are doing a project on this. Nick Timothy's leading on a Future of Conservatism project that will, I think, be probably quite heavily post-liberal. And I think some of the other think tanks are looking to pivot towards this as well. So there is going to be a battle between those two, as well as, the usual kind of continuity, Cameronism, flying the flag for sensible centrism.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Tom Jones, thank you so much for taking the time, coming to our studio to talk to us about this. Like I said at the top, brilliant Substack. I'd encourage all of our audience to check it out if you want to understand internal Conservative politics, the ideas that are floating around. It's well worth your time. So Tom, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.